Despite the fact that Season 5 of The Chosen is still months away, anticipation is already growing. Maybe that's because we already know a lot more about Season 5's plot than we do about any of the others. Based on what we've seen thus far and what we know from Scripture, I'll be making some predictions about what we can anticipate in Season 5 below. You have most likely heard the blueprint for the remaining seasons of The Chosen by now, even if you studiously avoid spoilers and insider information about the show, which is what I usually do. The events of Holy Week, including but not limited to Jesus' crucifixion, will be portrayed in Season 5 of The Chosen. The Chosen's 6th season will almost entirely center on the actual crucifixion. The resurrection of Jesus and some of the fallout will be revealed in Season 7, the last season of The Chosen. However, The Way of the Chosen, a follow-up series that follows the events documented in the Book of Acts and Paul's letters, will carry on the plot. The writers of The Chosen had a great deal of freedom to select and reorder biblical events when creating seasons 1 to 4 of the show, because the Gospels aren't concerned with creating an exact chronology of the events of Jesus' ministry that occurred before Holy Week. However, we have a far better idea of what to expect in Season 5, because the events of Holy Week are much more clearly defined, even though the precise order of those events isn't always evident. When will The Chosen Season 5 be released? Dallas recently revealed that Season 5 of The Chosen will debut in early April 2025. Although the precise date has not yet been decided, it is expected to occur around the first or second week. It is the ideal moment for the new season, which is entirely centered on Holy Week, as Holy Week 2025 starts on April 13th and Easter comes on April 20th. Key Holy Week events in The Chosen Season 5. The events of Holy Week that I anticipate seeing in The Chosen Season 5 are listed below. Along with enumerating events, I highlight many details as well as some seeming inconsistencies that are included in all 4 Gospels. In addition, I forecast certain aspects of the show, such as character growth. The Triumphal Entry on Palm Sunday. Matthew 21:1-17, Mark 11:1-11, Luke 19:28-46, John 12:12-50. As Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, he is met by a rapturous mob of followers who praise him with the lyrics of Psalm 118. Some of the accounts include other information in addition to these essential facts. Jesus is chastised by the Pharisees in Matthew and Luke for permitting his disciples to refer to him as the Son of David, an overtly messianic term. Jesus is unfazed. Jesus enters the temple, according to Matthew, Luke, and Mark, but in Matthew and Luke, Jesus also cleans the temple. According to Mark, this incident took place the next day. John dates the temple's cleansing close to the start of Jesus' ministry, outside of Holy Week. As Jesus gets closer to Jerusalem in Luke, he laments the city's opposition to his rule and prays that it would be destroyed by Rome. The throng gathers to meet Jesus, according to John, primarily because they have heard about Lazarus' resurrection. John also recalls an interaction between Jesus and Greek travelers that was made possible by Andrew and Philip. This leads Jesus to look forward to his crucifixion and make a commitment to exalting God's name. Although some in the crowd believe it to be the voice of an angel or hear merely thunder, God reacts by loudly confirming Jesus. Since the Triumphal Entry preparations start in Season 4, Episode 8, the real event is most likely going to happen in Season 5, Episode 1. All of the essential components and the majority of the extra information found in the 4 Gospels should be present, in my opinion. The only actual dispute is whether The Chosen will position the temple's cleansing at the conclusion of the Triumphal Entry, as Matthew and Luke do, or whether it will follow Mark and take place the following day. For dramatic and historical reasons, I anticipate that the show will stick to Mark's account of events. Dramatically, separating the Triumphal Entry from the temple's cleansing would allow each event to be the focus of its own episode. Historically, it's more likely that Luke and Matthew have omitted Jesus' 2 trips to the temple for simplicity's sake than that Mark created an extra visit that doesn't really serve a narrative purpose. Naturally, as we've seen in seasons 3 and 4, both episodes would probably contribute to a premiere arc consisting of 2 to 3 episodes. The tale of the Greeks approaching Philip and Andrew and requesting a meeting with Jesus is the only other aspect of the triumphal entry that merits discussion. Leander, the Greek convert we met in season 3, is most likely going to be involved in this event. For this reason, Philip and Andrew developed a connection in season 3. Because it foreshadows the eschatological gathering of the nations to Jerusalem, e.g., Isaiah 60, the encounter between Jesus and the Gentile Greeks is a theologically significant occurrence. Additionally, the Jewish leaders who fear Rome's anger may perceive Jesus as posing a greater threat to Rome as a result of this incident. The cleansing of the temple. As previously mentioned, the temple's purification is occasionally shown as a distinct event and other times as part of the triumphal entry's activities. All of the Gospels concur on the fundamentals, notwithstanding their seeming disagreement on the exact date of the cleansing. Because he saw it as an insult to the purpose of God's home, Jesus expelled people selling sacrificial animals from the temple complex, which infuriated the religious establishment. Matthew 21:12-16, Mark 11:15-18, Luke 19:45-46, John 2:14-22. However, once more, the different narratives have distinctive elements. Luke's account is the shortest and the only one that doesn't expressly talk about turning tables and chasing out the money changers. In Matthew, Jesus welcomes and heals the blind and lame after expelling the money changers and vendors. Jesus states in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that God's house is supposed to be a house of prayer, referring to Isaiah 56:7, but is actually a den of thieves, referring to Jeremiah 7:11, which seems to imply that this is part of the temple's actual purpose to serve as a place where the weak can pray for and receive healing. Isaiah 56 envisions Gentile travelers visiting the temple to pray there. Jesus makes this more clear in Mark when he states that the temple would be a house of prayer for all nations. In John, Jesus challenges the leaders to destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up when they chastise him. This phrase is attributed to Jesus by his opponents when they accuse him of endangering the temple, even though Jesus does not use it in the other Gospels. Matthew 26:60, Mark 14:58. Additionally, Jesus' use of a whip is mentioned explicitly only in John's version. According to certain interpretations, the incident that is recounted in John 2 is actually different from the synoptic account of the temple's washing. In other words, early in his ministry and near the end of his ministry, Jesus cleansed the temple twice. If Jesus had cleaned the temple earlier in his ministry, even before he called the disciples, we would still expect the Jewish officials to have brought it up by now. Therefore, it seems quite unlikely that the chosen will adopt this strategy. Although I anticipate it will also have the distinctive characteristics noted in John, it appears far more likely that the show will adhere to the synoptics. According to several interpretations, the temple's purification was a prophetic act intended to portend its collapse. God will eventually use the Roman armies to expel the dishonest Jewish establishment from Jerusalem, just as Jesus did when he used a whip to force the money changers out of the temple. Jesus' lectures during Holy Week center on the impending destruction of Jerusalem and the fall of the Jewish elite. Therefore, I anticipate that the Chosen's producers will examine that issue. Naturally, it's a complex subject that might spark a lot of debate, as I've discussed elsewhere. Judas will be quite alarmed by this inference, which will truly drive Shmuel over the edge. Jesus debates the priests, Pharisees, and Herodians in the temple. Following the temple's purification, the synoptics document a number of discussions, lessons, and other events. These consist of the fig tree's curse, which is another prophecy that foretells Jerusalem's destruction. Matthew 21:18-19. The argument concerning the authority of John and Jesus. Matthew 21:23-27. Parables concerning the religious authorities' inability to react to Jesus. Matthew 21:28-28, 22:14. In Matthew 22:15-22, the Herodians and Pharisees attempt to trap Jesus by questioning Caesar about taxes. In Matthew 22:23-33, the Sadducees argue with Jesus over the resurrection. In Matthew 22:34-40, a lawyer questions Jesus on the greatest commandment. Jesus silences the Pharisees by asking how Christ could be David's son, given that David addresses him as Lord. Matthew 22:41-46. Jesus bemoaning Jerusalem and denouncing the scribes and Pharisees. Matthew 23. In Luke 21:14, Jesus praises the widow's mite over the affluent people's extravagant and conspicuous contributions. There is some wiggle room for these occurrences throughout the show. As they created episodes 2 through 5, I could see the authors selecting and rearranging these occurrences. Here we'll witness the emergence of several of the characters and factions who debuted in Season 4. I also anticipate seeing a lot of Yanni and Ian Shmuel. Jesus spares the woman caught in adultery. The sole event on this list that is not canonically mentioned in the stories of Holy Week found in the Gospels is this one. Actually, the majority of academics doubt that it is mentioned in any of the original biblical texts. Many historians believe that the tale was added to John by a later scribe, because our earliest copies of John do not have it. Even though the majority of current Bibles include it in the Gospel of John with an asterisk 753-811. Nevertheless, the tale is well known and cherished. Jesus is accosted by Pharisees who have a woman who has been caught in adultery when he is at the temple. As required by the law of Moses, they ask Jesus if she should be stoned. As the men gradually file out, beginning with the oldest, Jesus instructs the one without guilt to hurl the first stone and then sit and write in the dust. The woman is finally told by Jesus that he does not condemn her but rather charges her with sin no more. Jesus' arguments with the priests and Pharisees in the temple may well contain this story. In fact, it is located exactly there in the You Are Jesus movie The King of Kings 1927. This story, along with Jesus' argument with the Sadducees regarding the resurrection and the future of a woman who has been married more than once, could be included in an episode that has a marriage-related theme. Additionally, I have put up a somewhat contentious theory. Joanna will probably be the one caught in the act of adultery. Joanna's romantic activities could be interpreted as adultery because she might not be able to legally divorce Chusa, her lecherous husband. In essence, Jesus' adversaries would be putting pressure on him to either renounce the law of Moses or sentence his own disciple to death, a win-win situation in their perspective. Additionally, it would go well with the subject of faithfulness and unfaithfulness that I anticipate seeing. Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple and the coming of the Son of Man. When Jesus sees his students admiring the temple's architecture after concluding his arguments there, he seizes the chance to foretell the temple's destruction. Matthew 24-25, Mark 13, Luke 21. Jesus begins a longer prophecy and ends with foretelling the arrival of the Son of Man when the disciples ask him for further information. Given how much Christians disagree on how to read the scripture, it will be difficult to adapt Jesus' predictions. Nevertheless, I anticipate that the chosen will accept the challenge head-on. I wouldn't be shocked if this incident had a significant impact on the season's plot, possibly serving as a mid-season turning point around episode 4 or 5. Judas may not be thrilled when Jesus begins prophesying sorrow and disaster since he is so optimistic about Israel's bright future. Maybe that will be one of the things that pushes him over the edge. Judas conspires with the chief priests. Judas meets the chief priests before the Last Supper and offers to betray Jesus in return for cash. Matthew 26:14-16, Mark 14:10-11, Luke 22:1-6, John 13:2. As the tension increases, I anticipate that we will witness this incident in episodes 4-6. Even while the canonical gospel texts all concur that Judas deliberately sought to betray Jesus and did so in exchange for money, gospel modifications frequently offer Judas complicated motivations. In some versions, Judas is tricked and coerced into betraying Jesus by the Jewish authorities rather than pursuing them. In other cases, Judas betrays Jesus with the purpose of controlling him or compelling him to act. In still other cases, Judas' deed is driven by disappointment after it is shown that Jesus has no intention of starting a revolution. None of these ideas are present in the canonical biblical stories, although some of them have their origins in contemporary historical reconstructions or the New Testament Apocrypha. Judas appears to be receiving complicated motivations from the chosen, based on what we have seen thus far. Judas' devotion to Jesus, or at least his conception of Jesus, is true, and we have every reason to think so. But as Judas starts to see that Jesus' plans don't align with his own, that dedication begins to falter in Season 4. Judas thinks Jesus will bring Israel back to life, lead it against Rome, and go on to build his own magnificent empire. Judas begins to strongly doubt the movement's direction after Jesus declines the chance to form an alliance with the religious establishment through Shmuel. I anticipate that as Jesus exhibits increasingly more provocative behavior in Jerusalem, Judas' disenchantment will only deepen. Additionally, I wouldn't be shocked if we witnessed him betraying Jesus in the hopes that Jesus would be compelled to take action. Another aspect of Judas' treachery is worth mentioning. When Judas betrays Jesus, Luke and John both imply that Satan is directly influencing him. It's up for argument what they signify. It will be intriguing to observe whether Satan's influence is explicitly shown in The Chosen, and if so, how it is presented. Will Judas get possessed by a demon? Will Satan appear to him, either physically or in a dream? Or will Satan's influence only be hinted at? Jesus washing the disciples' feet, the Last Supper, and the Upper Room Discourse. According to every gospel story, Jesus has a farewell dinner with his followers during which he foretells his betrayal, causing them to become very anxious and to quarrel. Jesus tells Peter that he will fall away that very night when he boasts that he would never depart. Judas departs to betray Jesus during the supper, Matthew 26:17-34, Mark 14:12-25, Luke 22:7-38, John 13-19. Once more, every account provides unique information regarding the event. John seems to imply that the meal was on the day before Passover, even though the synoptics all point to a Passover feast. This could be because John wishes to imply that Jesus is the real Passover. According to the synoptics, Jesus shares a cup of wine, which is described as his blood of the covenant, poured out for everyone, and breaks bread, which is described as his body. He exhorts them to continue the custom in his honor. In an odd aside found in Luke, Jesus appears to urge the disciples to sell their cloaks in order to purchase swords, but he then contradicts the apparent meaning of his statement by claiming that the 2 swords they already possess are sufficient. In John, Jesus clearly subverts the typical rabbi-disciple connection by washing his disciples' feet after the meal and telling them to love one another in the same way. In Mark and Matthew, Jesus tells his disciples to meet him in Galilee following his resurrection. In a long farewell address recorded in John, Jesus teaches his followers about love, the Holy Spirit comforter, prayer, living in Christ, and the resistance they would face from the outside world. A lengthy prayer on behalf of the disciples and the future church closes this lecture. All of the important Last Supper events will most likely be shown in Season 5, though the Upper Room Discourse, which is quite long, will likely be condensed. Around episodes 5 to 7, I wouldn't be shocked if the supper was the subject of a sort of standalone bottle episode. Gospel readers frequently question why Judas' betrayal goes unnoticed by the other disciples. Judas will probably accuse Thomas of betraying him in an attempt to dispel suspicion. After all, Thomas harbors the most blatant animosity toward Jesus and has been behaving in some most dubious ways. The drama would undoubtedly be quite strong. Jesus arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. Following dinner, Jesus leads the disciples to a secluded garden, according to all of the Gospels. A group of soldiers and chief priests' servants, commanded by Judas, interrupts them and betrays Jesus. Jesus chastises some of the disciples who try to fight back. Jesus is led away by the soldiers as the disciples disperse. Matthew 26:36-57, Mark 14:32-53, Luke 22:39-54, John 18:1-12. Once more, we find particular information strewn throughout the Gospels. The well-known account of Jesus pleading with God to take away his cup from him is found in the Synoptics. But while Peter and the other disciples continue to nod off, Luke 22:42 states, "Not my will, but yours, be done." Jesus ends up shedding blood, Luke 22:44, and declares that he is very sorrowful, even to death, Matthew 26:38. In the Synoptics, Judas gives Jesus a cheek kiss to assist the soldiers in identifying him. But in John, when the soldiers call out for Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus answers, "I am," and the soldiers are knocked to the ground, as though they are kneeling down in homage to the great I Am. The disciple who attacked the high priest's servant is not identified in the Synoptics, most likely to protect him from punishment. Peter is identified as the attacker in John, which was most likely written after Peter's passing. Mark contains an odd digression about a young man who is nearly taken but manages to get away by ripping off his clothing and fleeing nude. Luke is the only narrative that mentions Jesus curing the servant that Peter attacks. The young man in question, according to interpreters, is Mark himself, who discreetly signs his work with a humiliating personal story. The final thing I'm sure we'll witness in Season 5 is the arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane. Although I personally anticipate that the season will conclude following Jesus' trial, I wouldn't be shocked if it ended with Jesus being carried away into the night and the disciples dispersing. It would really highlight loyalty and infidelity, which I anticipate will be a major issue in Season 5. Nevertheless, I believe that Jesus' arrest is more likely to occur in episodes 6 or 7. The only true adaptive issue is coordinating the soldiers' identification of Jesus, which is likely to encompass all of the main components seen in all 4 Gospels. I can't imagine Judas' kiss being omitted because it is so famous. That seems difficult to convey Jesus' I Am moment in a visual format, so I could imagine that being left out. However, I wouldn't be shocked if The Chosen managed to combine the 2 versions of the tale. It could, in fact, be crucial to Quintus's storyline. I wonder if the Mark anecdote is included in the show. Although the anecdote has a light-hearted tone that perfectly complements the overall tone of the show, it may be difficult to reconcile with the overall tone of the episode. We may anticipate that Mark will be introduced early in the season if the narrative is incorporated. Mark's persona could serve a number of purposes, because some people think that his family hosted the Last Supper. Jesus questioned and condemned by the chief priests and Sanhedrin. Compared to some of the other sections of the account, the precise order of events after Jesus' arrest is a little less obvious. According to the Gospels, Peter goes with Jesus to the high priest's home. There, Peter fulfills Jesus' prophecy by denying being a disciple 3 times while Jesus is questioned, unjustly accused, and struck. Matthew 26:57-27-2, Mark 14:53-15-1, Luke 22:54-71, John 18:12-27. Other aspects of the narrative, however, are less clear-cut. According to the Synoptics, Jesus is taken directly to Caiaphas, the high priest, who interrogates him late at night alongside a few of the other top priests and elders. The Sanhedrin is then called to condemn Jesus at the crack of dawn on Friday. Before being sent to Caiaphas, Jesus is first shown to Annas, Caiaphas' father-in-law, in John. John makes no mention of a Sanhedrin assembly. According to every gospel story, a servant girl is the first to accuse Peter of being a disciple. In Matthew, he is also accused by a passerby and another servant girl. In Mark, he is accused twice by the original servant girl and a 3rd time by a bystander. The names of Peter's accusers are not mentioned by Luke. In John, Peter is accused twice by a gang and a 3rd time by a relative of Malchus, the high priest's servant. In Mark, the rooster crows twice before Peter's 3rd refusal. The 3rd denial appears to occur before the rooster crows once, according to the other accounts. Jesus is unjustly accused of threatening to destroy the temple in Matthew and Mark, but he declines to respond to the charge. As Jesus is asked if he is the Christ in every one of the synoptics, he answers that he is the Son of Man. This answer is considered blasphemous. This conversation takes place during Jesus' trial in Luke, although it occurs during his initial interrogation in Matthew and Mark. John exclusively documents the conversation between Jesus and Annas, during which Jesus is thrashed for his impoliteness and refuses to explain anything beyond what he has publicly preached. In John, Peter is escorted by John, the adored disciple who has a relationship to the high priest's household and can gain entry to the gate. Jesus' trial may occur in Season 6, as I mentioned above, but I believe it will most likely occur in Season 5, most likely in Episodes 7 or 8. Because the interrogation before Annas doesn't really add anything and necessitates the inclusion of an otherwise superfluous character, I have a suspicion that the program will stick to the synoptic version of the story for simplicity's sake. Judas' regret and suicide. Judas wants to return the 30 pieces of silver after Jesus is convicted in Matthew, claiming that he has betrayed innocent blood. He throws the money down and leaves to hang himself when the priests won't accept it. A cemetery for strangers is then purchased with the funds. Matthew 27:3-10. In Acts 1:18-19, Luke seems to imply that Judas buys the field himself, falls in it, and tears it apart. Though I'm not sure if the suicide will be shown on TV, The Chosen hasn't shied away from graphic material such as Mary's demonic possession and Eden's horrific miscarriage. Judas will undoubtedly commit suicide, likely in Episode 8, but I wouldn't be shocked if it happens off screen and we just witness other characters' responses and conversations about Judas passing. The play might avoid harmonizing Matthew and Acts if we don't see the body, yet many interpreters have managed to do so. Jesus questioned, beaten, and handed over by Pilate. According to every gospel, Jesus is taken to Pontius Pilate in the early hours of the morning after being condemned by the Jewish authorities. When Pilate questions Jesus, he finds no culpability despite the priests and elders accusing him of deceiving the populace and claiming to be the Messiah king. The leaders press Pilate to free Barabbas the robber instead of Jesus in order to satisfy the custom of an annual Passover pardon. Jesus wears a purple robe, a crown of thorns, and is ridiculed and thrashed. Pilate absolves him of blame by sending him to be crucified in response to pressure from the Jewish authorities and masses. Matthew 27:26, Mark 15:120, Luke 23:125, John 18:28, 19:16. However, a few specifics are specific to each account. According to the synoptics, Jesus responds, "You have said so," when Pilate asks him if he is the king of the Jews. Jesus and Pilate discuss the nature of Jesus' kingdom and mission in much greater detail in John. After the Jewish officials accuse Jesus of claiming to be the Son of God, John also recounts a second exchange between Jesus and Pilate. Pilate is alarmed by this charge and begs Jesus to clarify himself. But Jesus only responds with a quick remark in which he reminds Pilate that his authority is derived. Because Galilee is under Herod's authority, Pilate has Herod interview Jesus in Luke. Herod is excited to see Jesus work a miracle and ask him questions. Herod agrees with Pilate's assessment and sends Jesus back to him when he doesn't answer when the priests accuse him. It is said that this exchange helps to resolve a conflict between the two leaders. Pilate condemns Jesus to death and has him scourged in Matthew and Mark. After being questioned by Herod but before being sentenced by Pilate, Jesus is ridiculed and thrashed in Luke. In Luke, Pilate proposes to have Jesus beaten once again in an attempt to persuade the multitude to free him. Before finally putting Jesus to death, Pilate in John has him beaten in a sort of last-ditch effort to please the mob. The only story that tells us that Pilate's wife had a dream about Jesus and begged him to avoid him is Matthew's. It's unclear if Season 5 or Season 6 will feature Jesus' trial before Pilate and his scourging. Dallas has stated that Jesus' crucifixion will be the primary subject of Season 6, yet it's difficult to see how a single event like the crucifixion could be extended into a whole season. This has led some fans to believe that some of the events that precede the crucifixion, such as Jesus' trial and scourging, will also be featured in Season 6. Although that looks like a possible scenario, I believe that Episode 8 will most likely center on Jesus' trial before Pilate. I don't think the program will let the characters sit around doing nothing until Season 6, considering how much work Season 4 put into setting up Pilate, Claudia, and Herod. It would make perfect sense to conclude with Jesus' judgment, because judgment in many senses of the word would most likely be a major theme in Season 5. Additionally, I believe that if Season 5 opens with Jesus entering Jerusalem to cries of applause and concludes with Jesus leaving Jerusalem to cries of mockery, there would be a lovely symmetry. I believe the musical will use aspects from all of the tales to depict the true nature of Jesus' stay in Pilate's household. Pilate and Atticus reflect on truth and belief in Season 4, which is because we will undoubtedly receive John's longer, more intellectual conversations between Jesus and Pilate. In Seasons 3 and 4, Claudia is clearly set up by the program to warn Pilate, just as she does in Matthew's story. Additionally, we will witness Herod's interrogation of Jesus, which is recounted in Luke. Once more, Season 4 blatantly establishes this by bringing Herod to Jerusalem. The most dramatic alternative would be for Pilate to finally give in and condemn Jesus to death after ordering his scourging as a sort of last-ditch effort to please the mob. I have a suspicion that the production will also follow John's story in this regard. I can't see the program going there, at least not for long scenes, even if it's more factually possible that Jesus was beaten several times. There will be a lot of setup if Jesus' trial is shown in Season 5. I predict that the show will introduce Barabbas as the philosophical opposite of Jesus by incorporating his backstory into the early episodes. We can anticipate seeing Quintus' character appear sooner in the season to establish his role if my prediction that he will take part in Jesus' scourging is correct. I wouldn't be shocked if these two characters turned out to be related. Quintus might be the one to capture Barabbas first. The Chosen Season 5 Cold Open Prologues. The Chosen is renowned for its chilly open prologues, which include a mix of flash-forwards to the early apostolic period, backstories of minor characters, and Old Testament stories with a common theme. Although I'm sure there may be some surprises, I anticipate seeing the following scenes. The narrative of David's betrayal by his advisor Ahithophel and son Absalom, 2 Samuel 15. A flash-forward to Jerusalem's destruction in 70 AD, or the account of Jerusalem's initial destruction in 586 BC, 2 Kings 25. Barabbas' character backstory, Quintus narrative connecting where we left him in Season 4 Episode 4 to where he is at the start of Season 5. How do you feel about my forecasts? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below, along with your own predictions and the scenes and storylines you are most looking forward to seeing.